Hello. This is a special edition of This Week with David Rovics, a tour of my latest album, Songs for Today. Songs for Today is also the name of my 2019 world tour, which between the summer and the fall will definitely be taking me to various parts of Scandinavia, England, Scotland, and parts of the US. If you might be up for organizing a stop on the tour, I'd love to hear from you. Okay. From 10 a.m. until about 9 p.m. on Wednesday, May 29th, I was working with an award-winning musician, producer, engineer, and studio owner named Billy Oskay, along with his assistant engineer, Peter Wells, to record 13 songs. We took a few minutes off to chat or have a snack or make some coffee now and then, but otherwise it was noses to the grindstone. The result, by the end of the day, is my latest solo acoustic studio album titled Songs for Today, in the form of 13 very high-quality WAV files that I put into a Dropbox folder. For now, I'm making the album exclusively available to members of my CSA, or Community-Supported Art Program, where everyone who signs up gets access to a folder with 42 albums in it, some of which are only available to CSA members, such as my latest. But if you don't mind listening to me ramble on about each song before you hear it, you can also take in the album by listening to this special edition of my weekly podcast, This Week with David Rovics, episode 44. I've never done a tour of an album in a podcast, but I also wasn't doing podcasts when I made any of my previous 41 albums, and it seemed like a good idea. For a variety of reasons, but partly because it works well with the theme of several of my recent missives related to the economic and other logistical realities of being a working, independent musician. What exactly goes into making an album? Where did these songs come from? What was involved with writing and recording them? It seems like a worthwhile topic to explore, using this album to do it, one song at a time. Before I continue, for people who enjoy this podcast and the music within it, if you're able to join my CSA, that would be amazing, and you can do that by going to davidrovics.com/subscribe. If that's beyond your means, don't worry about it, but feel free to tell other people about it who you may know, who like my music and also might be more gainfully employed than you or I are. Also, please feel free to let folks know that they can hear this podcast by searching for This Week with David Rovics on any of the usual podcasting platforms. The album is called Songs for Today, but I almost called it Somewhere on Spotify. I decided against that title. Not exactly sure why, but anyway, the album both begins and ends with songs related to a particular struggling profession with which I am most intimately familiar, the independent touring recording musician. Most of the songs on the album were written over the course of the past 9 months or so, but the first and last songs on the album are both songs I wrote the most recently, during the past month. What predicated both of these songs, along with other songs I've written on related subjects, is decades of experience as a touring musician working in a collapsing industry. Having been on Spotify and most other streaming platforms since they came into existence, it was fairly obvious that this was going to be the music industry's game plan to do what they could to recoup their losses, and that it would be their newest method of screwing struggling independent artists around the world. Recently, I've read extensively on the subject and have discovered that my suspicions are shared by people who know much more about the details than I do. Somewhere on Spotify you'll find a playlist with most of what I've written, with barely a song missed. Like my first album, which I hopped out on the road, I'd spend earnings on expenses. That's how the money flowed. After just a little while, it became a circular thing. It was a pattern where each year I would sing into a mic in a studio somewhere. And I'm not looking for everything to be perfectly fair. It's nice that it's all free now, but there are days I miss. But I could make a living at this. Somewhere on Spotify Spotify, you'll find the albums that I made from the time the bills stopped being paid. By an exchange so simple ever since the days began, when just covering the costs meant first begging from my fans, spending all this money again in a studio, end up with another album and nothing else to show except a dozen songs on Spotify for me to give away. 6,000 monthly listeners, $7 a day. It's nice that it's all free now, but there are days I miss when I could make a living at this. Somewhere on Spotify you'll find a million people like me, veterans of what was called the indie music industry. You'll find us there, along with all the youth who'd be forgiven for not knowing that it is the truth, that it wasn't long ago folks like me could pay the rent. We didn't need to hop freight trains or live in a tent. There was a little while when the internet seemed cool. Now we all get reamed while big tech rules. It's nice that it's all free now, but there are days I miss when I could make a living at this. Somewhere on Spotify you'll find a playlist. A little over a year ago, I got word from folks in Manitoba that plans were afoot to commemorate the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. The folk festival organizers and labor organizers in Manitoba, who had brought me there on a couple occasions in the past, were planning to do it again, for the first time in at least 6 years, as far as I could recall. This gave me plenty of time to read up on the history of the strike and write a song about it, which I eventually did last December. I was already familiar with a lot of the context of the heady times the strike took place in, the 19-teens, with the backdrop of wars, revolutions, and many other general strikes in many other countries, including in other cities in Canada. Reading the many accounts of the strike, which emphasized the total solidarity in the city of Winnipeg among native-born Canadians, immigrants of all kinds, veterans of the First World War, non-veterans, unionized and non-unionized workers, and even ultimately the police themselves, the chorus hit me. I wrote the song as if I had been there, and obviously I wasn't, so on a couple different levels one's disbelief must be suspended, but that's how it is when you're writing from someone else's perspective, which is a fine thing to do on a regular basis, I find. And although I wasn't there myself, I can be sure that when I say, if you weren't there, you'll never know just what it was like when the whole city went on strike, this is true. For me, too. I can only dream and write. War came, men were drafted, many never made it back. Those who did discovered, in their absence they got the sack. Tenements and squalor, both rats and people getting sick. What they had in common, life was short, death was quick. No one had a plan, what they were going to do. When all the men came back home and the ranks of the unemployed grew, the way the people had to live was no life at all, but it still came as a surprise. How many answered the call? If you weren't there, you'll never know just what it was like when the whole city went on strike. City leaders and newspapers, in many ways they tried to do everything they could to widen the divide between good Canadians and those they called alien scum, between those who missed conscription and those who beat the war drum. But when the veterans marched in Winnipeg, they marched for everyone, under the banner of the working class, the one big union. Everybody left their jobs, whether organized or not. Even the policemen walked away, refused to embrace the rot. If you weren't there, you'll never know just what it was like when the whole city went on strike.
mayor deputized the scabs. Soon they shot 2 men who died in the city center on the hour when the scabs rampaged through the city, attacking anyone in the street, trapping people in alleyways, not even allowing them to retreat. Soldiers occupied the city. People hadn't eaten in weeks. The prospects for victory began to look bleak. People went back to their jobs, if indeed they even could. The bosses said they'd seek revenge, and many of them would. If you weren't there, you'll never know just what it was like when the whole city went on strike. Strike leaders were imprisoned, from where several were elected to the Canadian Parliament. And a monument was erected at Main and Portage, where a streetcar was overturned, driven in by strike breakers on the spot where it was burned. It was a century ago, but life is often still defined by which side you were on. On that picket line, was your grandpa shot in the heart? Or did they break his leg when the working class rose up and shut down Winnipeg? If you weren't there, you'll never know just what it was like when the whole city went on strike. If you weren't there, you'll never know just what it was like when the whole city went on strike.
As a regular consumer of lots of world news in various forms, I've been closely following the ongoing and worsening economic situation in Venezuela that has been unfolding over recent years, particularly since the death of Hugo Chavez, who I opened for in Copenhagen in 2009, and who I wrote a song about before that. Without, if possible, tooting my own horn in some narcissistic way, I think it's interesting to briefly explore what exactly goes into writing a song like the third track on the album, In Venezuela. How would we break it down? Partly I just find it an interesting question because Spotify values one stream at 1/10 of 1 cent, which strikes me as elitist. Also because I, along with lots of other musicians, am often in the position of being asked to do a gig and being told that we will be paid traveling expenses. I always wonder exactly how this amorphous concept is defined, especially when they know they're talking to a musician who is not from their country. Traveling expenses from the last city I played in to the city you're in, or traveling expenses from Oregon to Europe? Do these expenses include food and lodging? How about paying the rent back at home and feeding the kids, and so on? On the surface, obviously the song was written after extensively following developments in Venezuela, amounting to hundreds of hours of news programs from many different news outlets, from many different countries and many different perspectives, as well as a similar amount of written material from a similar variety of sources. The perspective behind the song, though it's a short song, also required that I understand the nuances involved in terms of the current government in Venezuela not being without fault, but also not being primarily responsible for the current mess. Nowhere in the song do I present a black and white perspective, although this can obviously be inferred by anyone who really wants to infer one, given the small amount of information that you can really have in a decently written song. Equally, the perspective in the song also required an extensive knowledge of Latin American history and the history of U.S. imperialism in the world more broadly, and in Venezuela in particular. As with all the songs on the album, I'm using an open tuning called Dadgad, which I first learned from listening to the Scottish musician Dick Gowan, and then later discovered among many other players in the Scottish and Irish traditional music scenes especially. The dissonant chords that feature prominently in this song are ones I adapted from listening to, touring with, and learning from Scottish master guitarist Alistair Hewlett before his untimely death.
Chavez was elected, like every time he ran. When his socialists took power, that's when the changes began. The opposition started attacking every forward move, but reforms went ahead, the people's welfare improved. A land of such riches that had always gone to so few was reaching places ignored since 1492 in Venezuela. poured into the streets to stop the coup back then. They got the man that they elected back into power again. The Bolivarian Revolution became famous worldwide. Soon other socialist governments swept in a red tide. Between the Cuban doctors and the Venezuelan oil, millions got medical care, millions tilled the soil of Venezuela. Bush began the sanctions, Obama imposed more, a slow-burning, destabilizing economic war. Following the formula of the Chicago Boys team, used in many places to make economies scream. Oil prices plummeted, foreign holdings locked, invasions being planned, negotiations blocked in Venezuela. Revolution to Venezuela today, from the Seminoles to Salvador Allende. Look at their ankles, you'll see the chains. Imperial vampires, open veins. Those who stand up to the business elite, who cannot stand to see the workers in the driver's seat in Venezuela.
There are many songs about events that took place which I never would have heard about if I didn't travel so much. It also helps that at least some people know I'm always interested in hearing about things that someone thinks would make a good song. Last year was when I first learned of the trial of the Rotherham 12, in the small, struggling, post-industrial northern English city of Rotherham. Still today, if you mention the town of Rotherham in England, if anyone has heard of it, it has been in the context of tabloid press stories about Asian men grooming children to become victims in a pedophilia ring. To read the English tabloids, you would think that all the Asian men in Rotherham were pedophiles, though obviously we're talking about a tiny minority and no larger percentage than there is within the broader population. Groups of Nazis capitalized on the situation by holding monthly anti-Asian rallies in Rotherham. The fact that the police steered an anti-Nazi march directly in front of a group of Nazis essentially forced a confrontation and then went about actively vilifying and prosecuting the Asian men who defended themselves against Nazis is still little known in England or anywhere else in the world. But in the town of Rotherham, the trial saw many people from all walks of life mobilized in defense of these innocent men, who were ultimately acquitted. I only heard about the Rotherham 12 last year from Love Music Hate Racism organizers in the area who were putting together a gig for me, who were also very much involved with the Solidarity campaign. The song went through several revisions before it got to its present state, as I checked with LMHR organizers as well as one member of the Rotherham 12 to make sure I was getting all my facts straight, and just as importantly, to make sure I was accurately representing the emotions behind the whole situation, particularly given that I'm again writing this song from the first-person perspective, and I'm myself neither from Rotherham or of Asian descent, and I was not on trial either. Musically, the song's chords and structure once again owe a great debt to Alistair Hewlett. Fans of Alistair's, who are also serious guitarists, might notice the unusual dissonant chords in Dadgad in the song. The other musician who was very influential in the guitar style employed in this song is Ani DeFranco. I fell in love with her intense, percussive guitar style when I first heard her in the 90s. I developed my own right-hand thump technique to keep a steady rhythm in between chords and riffs around 2011, I guess, and it started finding its way into many of my songs, especially ones I wrote around 2011 and 2012, but it crops up again frequently in more recent songwriting efforts to varying degrees.
When the Nazis came to Rotherham, most people stayed indoors and closed their blinds. Let them have their Nazi rally, then try to leave the day behind. Then the Nazis came to Rotherham. In 14 months they marched 14 times, always accusing every Asian of every unspeakable crime. Then the Nazis were there in Rotherham when he was walking to the mosque to pray, Ocean Ahmed was beaten so savagely that he died that way. Then when the Nazis came back to Rotherham, this time the town was in the streets. So this time the cops kettled the march, and this time they forced the march to meet. The Nazis who hang out in Rotherham at a pub called the William Fry, who were waiting for the kettled marchers so they could attack them as they were passing by. And the police raid came at dawn, awakening everyone. I was there with my family, asking them, what have I done? What have I done? Attacked by the Nazis in Rotherham, they had to act in self-defense. How could this possibly be a criminal offense? The Nazis came to Rotherham, and then the Crown charged 12 men for defending children from racist attacks as they were forced to walk by the pub when the Nazis came to Rotherham. And then prison hung over the heads of those who defended their children instead of cowering under their beds. And the police raid came at dawn, awakening everyone. I was there with my family, asking them, what have I done? What have I done? The Nazis came to Rotherham, and the trial of the Rotherham 12 was the consequence of Asian men who dared to defend themselves. Those who fought the Nazis in Rotherham could have gone to prison for years, but they were found not guilty by a jury of their mostly white working class peers. The Nazis came to Rotherham. Some of them did time behind bars, though the Rotherham 12 were acquitted. The families are marked by the scars when the police raid came at dawn, awakening everyone. I was there with my family, asking them, what have I done? What have I done?
Jeremy Corbyn is the elected leader of the biggest political party by membership in all of Europe, the British Labour Party. As an avid listener to BBC World Service and active consumer of other British media, I might have been forgiven for thinking that Jeremy Corbyn was either a pitchfork-bearing anarchist with a recently contracted case of rabies or some kind of a clown. As a regular visitor to the island that contains England, Scotland, and Wales, I know differently. Jeremy Corbyn is a brilliant and morally upstanding human being. Not only does he have a stellar voting record and great eloquence when it comes to explaining his very sensibly left-wing positions on most everything, but he is a personal friend of friends of mine, and one of my best former gig organizers in England is now in his shadow cabinet. I wrote this song last November.
If you travel around Europe today, you'll find society stratified. You'll find an ever-widening political divide. You'll find a growing left and a right that's growing faster, convincing people they're the ones to avert the next disaster. You can see the dark clouds growing, taking over every space, except oddly enough, in a little place called England, where a growing chorus screams, I agree with Jeremy. The BBC ignored him, or they treated him like a clown. Transnational corporations said this man will bring us down. The Blairites in the party stabbed him in the back, and then they did it again. But after each attack, he was steady at the helm, at the job for which he was picked despite all the accusations. He's an anti-Zionist peacenik who wants to change the country and says the country, I agree with Jeremy. Most members of the parliament wish he'd go away, but as their elected leader, he's set to stay. And when he supports a candidate, they usually tend to win, which makes the Blairites fume, while the rest of us just grin. Between the BBC, the Tories, and all the corporate MPs, the tabloid press, the IMF, and all the landed gentry, they're pulling out the stops to stop the ascendancy of I agree with Jeremy. The case before the nation is the one that we all face. What direction now goes this human race? Do we give up on the missiles and tax the rich a lot, or give up on society and just embrace the rot? Among us who would tell us it's the foreigners to blame, not the Blairite Tory billionaires and their rigged neoliberal game. Each day the numbers grow, as each day new people see that they agree with Jeremy. I agree with Jeremy.
I have been writing songs about refugees for a long time now. Partly this is because I write songs about historical and current events, and refugees figure prominently into them in many different ways. Also, the reality of refugees and what people go through to get out of war zones is a phenomenon I have intimate second-hand experience with, being close friends with many refugees from many different war zones, from Guatemala to Afghanistan to Palestine. But particularly since what became known as the refugee crisis of 2015 in Europe, which hit me hard, you could say, because Europe is where I do most of my touring these days, and being in the little niche I'm in, I did a lot of gigs in 2015 throughout Europe, and even a few in the US, with and in solidarity with refugees from Syria, Iraq, Eritrea, and elsewhere. I became increasingly aware that what hit me so hard about this situation is partly how closely it resembled the kind of situation my own ancestors were in when they fled wars in Europe for the relative safety of New York. Shortly after writing the song My Great-Grandparents last fall, I learned that at least on my father's Eastern European Jewish side of the family, I have a lot in common with Donald Trump's xenophobic immigration czar, Stephen Miller, and Stephen Miller's uncle, who so eloquently denounced everything his nephew stands for in an open letter he published soon after I wrote the song.
My great-grandparents were refugees. That should be a normal thing to say. I was born in New York City. My people came from far away. They fled the generals and dictators, the warlords of Moscow and Budapest. You could be conscripted for the rest of your life, or you could head west. My great-great-grandparents were refugees too, just north and west of Brittany. Farmers in the hills somewhere on the starving side of the Irish Sea. They fled their colonial torturers. They fled starvation, slavery. They fled across the Atlantic along with millions of other refugees. My great-grandparents were refugees, but getting to the other side took such a toll, it seems, that my great-grandfather died. So when his son was a little kid, he grew up without a dad. And that's typical of the hard life so many other refugees had. My great-grandparents were refugees. Let me tell you what that means. They were escaping war-torn lands ruled by tyrants, kings, and queens. They did not come seeking fortune. They were not pioneers. Leaving home, their hearts were broken, all their cries fell on deaf ears. My great-grandparents were refugees. No one taught me that in school. It's dangerous information in the old game of divide and rule. My name is David Rovics, and I know who my people are. They're on that raft upon the ocean, they're in the trunk of that car. My great-grandparents were refugees. That should be a normal thing to say. I was born in New York City. My people came from far away.
I guess track 7 is the only song on the album that was written more than a year ago. I wrote Is That a Girl or a Boy in 2015. I don't even have to look it up because 2015 is the year I was mainly writing songs using an electric cello instead of a guitar as my main instrument for playing chords on, or some approximation thereof. It was one of many cello songs that never made it onto the one album of cello-backed songs I made, Punk Baroque. But pretty much every time I make a new album, I take some time to go over songs I've written over the past few years and that have never made it onto an album. There are many others I considered, but this is the only one I chose. There were also many songs I wrote in the past year that also didn't make the cut. Not because they weren't well-written songs, but mainly because I'm looking for a nice selection of different themes and different musical styles when I'm putting together an album, and a good album, like a good song, is generally best when it's neither too short nor too long. The song was inspired by kids I've known who have preferred to dress in clothes that are popularly identified as belonging to a gender other than the one that they generally identified with. It's a song for all the boys who like to wear dresses and all the other gender nonconformists. It was also inspired by the beautiful children's book Jacob's Dress and by other experiences in my own personal exposure to and slow development of an understanding of what so many people around me have been going through for so long, just because they don't conform to patriarchal gender stereotypes, gender norms and expectations which we would all be better off throwing out, I have come to believe. My own teenage daughter, Layla, has been a big part of my education on that front as well.
Ever since the days when you learned to dress yourself, you would reach for certain clothing. From your little shelf, you said, I want to dress like Mommy. And that's exactly what you did. You always did things differently. From most other kids, you'd be playing with a doll or some other toy when someone would ask, is that a girl or a boy? Someone would call your given name with you there in your dress, leaving some to wonder, with others left to guess. Are you an innie or an outie? A princess or a king? Do you like to play with tractors or wear angel wings? What's inside that box? Is it a bullet or a pearl? As someone else must ask, is that a boy or a girl? You'd pretend that you weren't bothered, but it was clear you were. Then one day someone asked you what pronoun you prefer. Learning there were options, and the choice was yours to make. For you, there was no question now which path you would take. You grabbed a piece of paper, signed it with a swirl as you announced, my name is Guinevere, and I am a girl. Ever since the days when you learned to dress yourself, you would reach for certain clothing from your little shelf.
I was once again thinking so much about my daughter At the time I only had one, now I have 2 daughters as well as a son. Last September, during the Supreme Court hearings and related activities going on around Brett Kavanaugh, who of course was confirmed as a member of the Supreme Court, where he now presides over us all. Hearing the testimony of Dr. Blasey Ford, hearing his pleas of total ignorance, it brought me back to my teen years, growing up around the same time as they did, in the same culture in which teenage male football players are given a massive carte blanche to behave in whatever misogynistic ways they want to, with no repercussions, leaving a trail of destruction, pain, and anger in their wake. Long before these particular hearings, though, I struggled with the idea of writing a song like the one I ended up writing, Behind Closed Doors. My own feminist education has been a gradual one, and I didn't want to write a song that somehow left me off the hook or implied that I have always lived up to my own standards of behavior, or that my standards have always been what they are now. I grew up in the same sort of suburbs as they did. I never behaved the way Brett Kavanaugh did, but I knew a lot of guys who did, like the entire football team in my high school one year. They talked about ending the football program and suspending the entire team. As I recall, they did neither, and the idea of criminal prosecutions wasn't even on the table. But listening to the way Blasey Ford described the party she was at, and the cultural environment and extreme forms of male entitlement around the football team in her suburb, in my suburb, I kept thinking of this one football player I knew from another town who bragged to me about how he got drunk and raped a fellow drunk teenager at a party they were both at one night. He thought that his actions made him both cool and funny. I didn't think he was either cool or funny, but it wasn't until last September that I started really wondering who was the girl he raped, and how has her life been over the past 35 years or so since that kid told me about his horrifying accomplishments. Then I thought about my own daughter, already in middle school, soon going off into the world.
You're on your own, you understand, although you're sitting in front of me. The world's big, the world's beautiful, there's so much for you to see. There are good people everywhere who are kind to their neighbors and friends. I hope you meet all the best ones. However, in the end, all I know for certain is whatever lies in store. The best and the worst things happen behind closed doors. You're on your own, I can't protect you. I can only hope I raised you well. So if you're in a situation, you might have the wherewithal to tell. Is this good? Is this exactly what I really want to do? 'Cause what you want is what matters here, and I hope you know that's true. All I know for certain is whatever lies in store. The best and the worst things happen behind closed doors. You're on your own, along with billions of people trying to find their path. Some are raised in loving empathy, but there are many reared by wrath. There are those like you, for whom the planet Earth is a wondrous place to share. But there are many who seem only to have learned how not to care. All I know for certain is whatever lies in store. The best and the worst things happen behind closed doors. The best behind closed doors.
The astute observer may have noticed thematic connections between songs appearing on the album. Sometimes I opted for musical diversity and the changing of keys from one song to the next over thematic connection, while other times all those factors came together fine. Tracks 4 and 5, about the Rotherham 12 and Jeremy Corbyn, are both about England, for example. Tracks 7 and 8 are both related to gender and gender roles. Tracks 2 and 3 are both about epic world historic struggles of the working class on planet Earth. Tracks 9 to 12 are all directly related to war and peace. Track 9, in 68, is an overview of some of the key events of 1968 on the streets of the U.S., France, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. The guitar part employs a bit of that thump I mentioned earlier, and some dissonant Hewlett-esque chords played with a slightly funky right-hand part. As with many other songs, this song was probably mainly written as a response to media coverage of 1968 that I was listening to throughout 2018, which did usually touch on protests as well as on sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but most of the coverage of the protests minimized them in terms of how much support the movement had, how global it was, how threatening it was to the powers that be around the world, and how much it changed the face of so many societies, despite the fact that the movement in the US, France, and other places was ultimately beaten back. It may not be much consolation, but if not for certain social movements, things might be even worse than they are now. The basic knowledge of history involved with writing a song like this involves a lifetime of reading history, news stories, traveling to key destinations, and personally knowing many of the people involved with this particular struggle, most of whom are still alive and currently in their 70s or 80s.
Let's mark this date together, lest it pass us by. Let's recall a moment when the powder keg ran dry, when all across the USA cities turned to embers. Anybody old enough vividly remembers everything that happened on that date. 50 years ago in 68, carpet bombing of the city of Hanoi, barely 2 decades after Little Boy. Draft cards burning, police stations on fire, the powers that be down to the wire. The naked emperor was the normative state. 50 years ago in 68, both ruling parties were exposed. The question of the day: Mr. President, how many kids did you kill today? If we try to draft more soldiers, said the general, I can't guarantee that we could maintain domestic tranquility. A society on the brink, the possibilities so great. 50 years ago in 68, it was a time when people everywhere were rising from their knees just outside the halls of power throughout the colonies. From Oakland to Algiers, from Saigon to Paris, structures laid bare for all to see. The use of force alone will not determine our fate. 50 years ago in 68, soldiers were kept in barracks lest they figure out the score, that love really can be more powerful than war. The ruling class tried desperately to gain the upper hand, faced with a society they didn't understand. They just about got stuck beneath the historical weight. 50 years ago in 68, anyone in power now knows it might not last, at least if they look back to the fairly recent past, when the consent of the governed was for a time withdrawn, when empires were challenged and some of them were gone, when the movement was global, liberation was its freight. 50 years ago in 68, 50 years ago in 68, 50 years ago in 68.
I studied political economy at the Evergreen State College for a few months in the fall of 1993. I was apparently unsuited for academia, and I didn't last long. But I had a lot of nice walks through the beautiful forested campus. I met a lot of nice people, and I attended a lot of fascinating lectures about politics and economics by Pete Boehmer, some of which I understood. I wrote this song as a surprise for his 75th birthday, but after I wrote it I liked it so much that I had to put it on the album so I might lose the element of surprise before his actual birthday party.
I first met him at a place that I knew well, where he's taught for several decades, where I went for a spell. When I once studied political economy, I attended all his lectures back in 1993. And every year since then, you'll hear in those halls the labor theory of value explained between those walls, the kind of sharp analysis that strikes fear in the oppressor. So let me sing a song for my professor. When I first met him, his kids were only tots. Fast forward to the present, they grew up a lot, which is impressive when you think of San Diego State, what almost happened to him, and what happened to his roommate when someone opened fire on the house that they lived in during the Vietnam War. They railroaded him to prison, almost taken out by COINTELPRO. He almost didn't have successors, so let me sing a song for my professor. When I first met him, I just had to grin as soon as he started talking. I thought I was in Brooklyn in English or in Spanish. He speaks a special version, reflection of his childhood, NYC immersion, the place his parents came to when they fled genocide, managing to make it to the other side. Just part of who he is, if I'm being the assessor. Let me sing a song for my professor. First met him, he took students overseas to meet some of the State Department's favorite enemies. Friend of socialism, foe of the elite, never held elected office, but he occupied a seat. They tried to get him fired, run him out of town. That little effort failed. The government backed down to the man who rose this morning, put the jeans on off his dresser. Let me sing a song for my professor. Let me sing a song for my professor.
A man from more or less the same generation as my professor, but on exactly the opposite end of the spectrum politically, was the late Senator John McCain. He was celebrated by liberals and conservatives alike for very mysterious reasons. To me, he was nothing more or less than a war criminal. Not just because he flew bombing missions over Vietnam as a young man, but because in his long life as a politician, he supported every war that ever came across his desk and every military expenditure at the expense of humanity, including his own. This is my remembrance of Senator John McCain, who died last August.
John McCain. Your grandfather was an admiral and your father was one too. When you turned 17, you knew what to do. You signed up for the Navy so you could make it rain, kill innocent civilians, dropping bombs from planes. John McCain, John McCain. John McCain. John McCain. John McCain. On your military service, you then made a run. You got into the Congress in 1981. In the halls of the Senate, you had only just arrived when you were caught up in corruption, one of the Keating Five. What should have been a loss, you turned into a gain. Not quite sure how you did it, the innocence you feigned. John McCain. John McCain. John McCain. John McCain. John McCain. You were the hero in the Senate who had survived the war, the one who would explain to them what they were fighting for. For each act of aggression, you would cheer along. You'd go visit the troops and sing your military songs. You'd thank them for their service, and then you'd watch them die as they fought for corporations launching missiles from the sky to the streets below, which would be covered with the stains, the blood of the innocent running down the drains. John McCain. John McCain. John McCain. John McCain. John McCain. You voted for austerity and every free trade deal. You never met an oil well you didn't think that you should steal. About the poverty around you, you never did a thing except more military spending and less of everything that matters to the people who want a peaceful place to be without some war-crazed senator calling them his enemy. You call yourself a maverick, whatever the heck that meant. You had lofty aspirations to be the U.S. president. Now you're dead, it's over, your terroristic reign. Too bad about the cancer in your brain. John McCain. John McCain. John McCain.
One of the biggest supporters of arming the criminal regime of Saudi Arabia and aiding the Saudi royal family in its apparent goal to completely destroy Yemen and kill all of the country's inhabitants was Senator John McCain. His own death came 20 days after the Saudi Air Force bombed a bus parked in a crowded outdoor market in Yemen, killing 44 children, among many others. They were all from the same school, out on a school trip. There were a couple of songs on the album that were significantly reshaped by my producer for the album, Billy Oskay, and Today in Yemen was one of them. Those of you who want to hear the difference can check out earlier versions of the song that you can find on the very first episode of my podcast, This Week with David Rovics.
There's a heat wave in Portland. The sun shines down. Sprinklers are running all over town. It's hot too in Yemen, but lucky for us, nobody here was on that bus where 44 children died today. Here the buses pass by, and they pass by again. In Sada the bus left, came back, and then 44 children died today. School trip, a picnic, as the bombings go on. I guess they should have stayed home. Now they're all gone. 44 children died. Today. Fragments of bodies and fragments of bombs litter the market square. Most of the fragments, if you wash off the blood, you'll see USA written there. Where 44 children died. Today. Today.
The last song on the album is, like the first one, about the struggle of the working musician in the post-piracy, for-profit streaming age. It is my musical effort to encapsulate what it is we need to do now, not to form an alternate platform or boycott the incredible infrastructure that we all now have at our fingertips in the form of platforms like Spotify, but to organize as a class against the ruling elite of big tech, as represented by predatory corporations such as Spotify and their predatory companion corporations such as Uber and Facebook. It is the theme song for the campaign I'm trying to get off the ground, which I'm calling the Penny Campaign for Streaming Justice.
If each time a song were streamed, I received 1 cent. This is exactly what I'd need each month to pay the rent. I made that calculation. Looking at the stats, must be a lot of other people wearing the same hat. The concept may not be perfect, but in the streaming age, if we want to form a movement, it could be the first stage. The idea is very simple. Set up some ground rules, otherwise big tech makes trillions, plays the rest of us for fools. Now I'm just dreaming about the day we might get a penny a play. It would not be a revolution, but as sure as the world is round, it'd be helpful to know how far you fall before you hit the ground. I'm a DIY musician, who knows for how long. What we need is union, so this is a union song. Now I'm just dreaming about the day we might get a penny a play. They say they're losing money, they'll say it to the end. But if you want to pay the landlord, you gotta have it to spend. Your labor should be valued, no need to genuflect. A tiny fraction of a cent is not enough respect. Now I'm just dreaming about the day we might get a penny a play. These vulture capitalists in Stockholm and San Francisco play their shell games and think that we don't know that they are getting rich from the music that we made. At what point do we start getting paid? Now I'm just dreaming about the day we might get a penny a play. We might get a penny a play. We might get a penny a play.
This has been a special edition of This Week with David Rovics, a tour of my latest album, Songs for Today, which you can download as an album by joining my CSA at davidrovics.com/subscribe. Hope to see you here next week for a shorter broadcast, more along the lines of the other 43 episodes before this one.